The moment Eva Cooper realized she was lost, the wind shifted and carried the first bite of early autumn cold down from the peaks above, as if the mountains themselves had decided to swallow her whole. She had climbed higher than she intended, following a rare stand of blue cohosh she had spotted from the lower trail, the small clusters of berries gleaming like dark jewels against the gray-green rock face. One plant had led to another, and another after that, and by the time her leather satchel was heavy with carefully wrapped specimens and her small journal was full of penciled notes, the sun had swung far to the west, and the trail she had followed up from Creede, Colorado, was nowhere she could recognize. It was the autumn of 1882. Eva was 24 years old, trained in the use of medicinal plants by her mother before fever had taken the woman 3 years past, and she had traveled west from Missouri with a single purpose: to establish herself as an herbalist in the mining communities that were sprouting like wild mushrooms across the San Juan Mountains. She had done reasonably well in Creede. The miners respected her knowledge, the women of the town trusted her tinctures and poultices, and the doctor who had grudgingly shared the same rough plank building with her had eventually admitted, after a bad case of lung inflammation that she had treated more effectively than he had, that she was not simply a nuisance. But the high country had called to her ever since she arrived, because at these elevations, above 10,000 feet where the air thinned, and the sky turned a shade of blue she had no word for, there were plants that simply did not exist in the lower valleys. Valerian root thick as a man's fist, wild echinacea, the gray-green lichens that could draw infection from a wound as effectively as any compress she had ever prepared. She had come up the trail alone, which the town would have told her was a foolish thing if she had announced her intentions, and so she had not announced them. Now the light was failing, the temperature was dropping in a way that felt less like evening and more like a threat, and the trail she sought had vanished somewhere in the jumble of loose shale and spruce timber below her. She descended carefully, testing each footfall on the unstable scree, her satchel pulling at her shoulder, her boots not made for this terrain. She was a practical woman, not a panicking one, and so she did not panic. She assessed. She had flint and a small folding knife in her coat pocket. She had water in a tin canteen. She had food enough for perhaps another meal. She had her blanket roll strapped to the top of her pack. If she could find shelter, she could survive the night, and in the morning she could use the sun to navigate back toward the valley. What she could not account for was the sound of the rockslide. It came without warning, a grinding crack above and to her right, and then the whole face of the slope seemed to breathe and shift, sending a river of stone and dust cascading toward her. She ran without thinking, scrambling left along a narrow ledge, her boots slipping, her hands grabbing for any purchase, and when the slide finally roared past her, she was pressed flat against a rock face with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The dust settled. She was alive. She was also, she discovered when she tried to move back the direction she had come, on the wrong side of a fresh debris field that had choked the narrow passage entirely. She could not go back. She could not go up. The only way was forward along the ledge, which curved around the shoulder of the mountain and disappeared into shadow. She followed it because there was nothing else to do. She had been walking along that ledge for perhaps 30 minutes, the cold deepening steadily, her fingers going numb inside her gloves, when she heard something that did not belong to the wind or the settling rock or the distant call of a hawk. She heard an axe. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, the clean crack of iron through wood, and it was coming from somewhere around the curve of the mountain ahead of her. She moved toward it with the focus of someone who understood exactly what it meant: another human being, a fire, possibly shelter and survival. She came around the curve and stopped. The cabin sat on a wide natural shelf of rock and earth, backed against a granite outcropping that sheltered it from the northern wind. It was built of spruce and lodgepole pine, the logs notched with precision, the roof thick with split shingles weighted down with flat stones against the mountain wind. A woodpile taller than a man and twice as wide stretched along the eastern wall. A spring box sat to the south, fed by a trickle of water that came directly from the rock face above. A rack of hides hung on a frame to the west, and below the rack, swinging an axe with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times before, was the largest human being Eva Cooper had ever laid eyes on. He was over 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the cabin behind him look almost modest by comparison. His arms, bare from the elbow down despite the cold, were corded with muscle that moved under his skin like rope under tension. His hair was dark, nearly black, and longer than fashion permitted, tied back loosely at his neck with a strip of leather. He wore a wool shirt rolled to the elbows, canvas trousers tucked into tall moccasin boots, and a beard that was trimmed enough to show the line of his jaw without being tamed into anything resembling civilization. He was, Eva noted with the detached observation of someone in genuine crisis, not the kind of man who needed civilization to approve of him. He heard her before she spoke. He set the axe head on the ground and turned around without any sign of alarm, as if women appeared on his mountain ledge every afternoon. "You are a long way from anywhere," he said. His voice was low and carried without effort, the kind of voice that had learned to cross open country. "I am aware of that," Eva said. "There was a rockslide. The trail is blocked." He looked at her for a moment, taking in the satchel, the pack, the herb-stained fingers of the hand she raised to push her hair back from her face. "You came up alone?" "Yes." "From Creed?" "Yes." He nodded once, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already suspected. "Come inside. You look like the cold is halfway through you already." "I am fine." "I can see your lips going blue from here," he said, and picked up the axe, drove it once into the chopping block with a single clean stroke that split the last log he had set, and then walked toward the cabin without looking back to see if she followed. She followed. Inside, the cabin was small and extraordinarily orderly. A cast iron stove dominated the center wall, radiating heat that hit her like a wall. A narrow bed was built into the corner, covered with heavy wool blankets and a bearskin. A workbench ran the length of the opposite wall, covered with tools, trap parts, hides in various stages of preparation, and the careful, systematic arrangement of a man who lived alone and had organized his space to function without fault. Shelves held tinned goods, dried provisions, ammunition, and 2 books so worn their spines had lost their text. A single oil lamp hung from the center beam. He set the remaining split wood beside the stove and began feeding it in with no wasted motion. "Boone Hayes," he said, not turning around. "Eva Cooper," she replied, and set her satchel carefully on the floor near the door, because she did not presume to take up more space than she needed. "I did not intend to impose. If you can tell me the safest route down from here, I will start immediately. It is 3 hours of daylight and the temperature is already 12 degrees below what it was this morning." He straightened and finally looked at her directly. His eyes were the color of the timber above the tree line, a dark, warm amber that did not fit the severity of his face but somehow fit the totality of him. "You are staying the night. I will sleep by the stove." She opened her mouth. "I am not discussing it," he said without heat. "There is soup on the stove. Sit down." It was not the manner of a man who expected argument. It was the manner of a man who had lived long enough with genuine danger to find the social courtesies around it somewhat exhausting. Eva, who prided herself on her own practicality, recognized the quality and sat down on the stool he indicated near the stove. The soup was elk broth with dried beans and wild onion, simple and dense and exactly what her body required. She ate 2 bowls. He ate one, standing at the workbench, cleaning a rifle component with methodical care. They did not speak much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who both understood how to be quiet. "What were you after?" he asked eventually, nodding at the satchel. "Blue cohosh primarily, and I found some excellent valerian root on the south face below the second ridgeline. Do you know it? Small clusters of white flowers earlier in the season root system that runs quite deep. It is excellent for pain relief and for helping the body sleep during recovery from illness. He considered this. I know the plant. I have pulled it out of my traps. Oh, it is not any good for traps. It has an odor that most animals avoid. Something shifted in his face, a small thing, barely a change. But Eva had spent enough time watching people for symptoms to notice it. So I have been clearing it without cause, he said. Without cause for your trapping, yes. If you had saved the root, I could have shown you several uses for it. But you have no way of knowing what I know, and I have no way of knowing what you know about this mountain, so perhaps we are even. He looked at her for a moment with that amber gaze. Then he went back to the rifle component, and there was something different in the silence after that. Something that had opened, very slightly, like a door that has been pushed rather than unlocked. She slept better than she had any right to expect, warm and safe in his narrow bed, while he stretched his large frame on a bedroll by the stove. In the morning she woke to the smell of coffee and pan bread and the sound of him moving outside, and when she pushed aside the bearskin and looked out the small window, she watched him carry water from the spring box with the same effortless economy he applied to everything. He guided her down the mountain that morning, taking a route that avoided the debris field entirely, a game trail she would never have found on her own that wound through the timber in switchbacks so gradual the descent barely registered. He walked in front and matched his pace to hers without comment, stopping when she stopped to examine something growing along the trail, waiting without impatience while she knelt to inspect a patch of wintergreen or cut a section of bark from a fallen aspen that she explained had useful properties for reducing fever. He asked questions. Not many, but pointed ones, the kind that told her he was actually listening to what she said rather than tolerating it. When she explained that the waxy coating on certain leaves was what preserved their medicinal properties through drying, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Same principle as the fat on a hide. You keep the useful part from drying out wrong." She had looked at him then, surprised. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." When they reached the edge of the lower trail and the first smoke from Creed's chimneys was visible in the valley below, he stopped and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "The high trails will be snowed in within 6 weeks," he said. "After the melt in spring, if you want to go back up, you should not go alone." She studied him. "Are you offering to take me?" "I am telling you it is not safe alone," he said, which was not quite an answer and somehow was. She thanked him. She descended into Creed. She thought about him for 3 days before she admitted to herself that she was thinking about him, and then she thought about him some more. The winter came down on Creed hard that year. The San Juans were uncompromising in cold weather, and by December the snow was deep enough that travel between the higher neighborhoods of town required effort, and the lower neighborhoods along the creek flooded twice from ice jams that sent water sheeting across the main street. Eva worked through it, treating frostbitten miners, compounding cough remedies from her dried stores, teaching the 2 women who had expressed interest in her methods the basics of distinguishing safe plants from dangerous ones, using drawings she made herself in the long evenings. She did not expect to see Boone Hayes until spring. He appeared in January. She was in her small workroom behind the apothecary space she had rented on the main street when the door opened, letting in a blast of cold air, and the man himself, snow-dusted and entirely unconcerned about the weather that had kept most of Creed indoors for 2 days. He was carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth under one arm and a fresh-caught snowshoe hare in his hand. "I come down for supplies every few weeks," he said by way of explanation, setting the hare on her workbench with the casualness of a man who had decided where things went and placed them accordingly. "Thought you might want this." He set the oilcloth bundle on the bench as well and unwrapped it carefully. Inside, preserved with evident care, were the dried roots and stems of a plant she recognized immediately. She looked up at him, startled. "Valerian, you dried it yourself." "I read one of your books." He said it simply, as if this were not remarkable. She looked at the workbench. There were no books she had given him. "Which book?" I asked the woman at the general store. She had a medical botany text from back east, published about 15 years ago. He shrugged one massive shoulder. It was not very accurate about what grows out here, but the drying instructions were sound enough. Eva felt something happen in her chest that she did not immediately classify. She looked at the dried valerian roots, which were in better condition than most she dried herself. And then she looked at the man who had gone to a general store, asked for a book on medicinal plants, and read it carefully enough to dry them correctly. Then she looked up at his face. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was quieter than she intended it to be. He stayed for the afternoon. She showed him how she was processing the autumn's harvest, the way she wrapped certain roots in paper rather than storing them in tins because the tin changed their character over time. He watched with the kind of attention that felt like full weight being applied, not polite interest but genuine focus, the same quality she had noticed when he had cleaned the rifle component in his cabin. He was a man who did not give partial attention to anything. When he left as the sun was setting, she stood in the doorway watching him move up the street toward the general store to collect his provisions, his big frame cutting through the snow without difficulty, and she understood for the first time that she had been looking forward to spring not primarily because of the plants she wanted to find. He came down every 3 weeks through the winter, reliable as the weather allowed. Each time he brought something, more dried specimens he had gathered and preserved according to his reading, which improved with each visit as he refined his technique. A set of small carved wooden boxes he had made himself for her to store roots in, fitted with tight lids. Once, a drawing of a plant he had found under a specific overhang on the north face that he could not identify from his book, rendered in pencil with surprising precision and annotated with notes about the soil composition and the direction of water drainage near its roots. She identified it immediately. "This is yellow monkshood. It is quite toxic, Boone. You should not handle it without care." He nodded, looking at her sketch overlay next to his drawing. "I figured it was not friendly, nothing that color usually is." He paused. "But the bees love it." "They have a tolerance that we do not," she said, and she was smiling without meaning to be, and when she looked up he was watching her smile with an expression that made her look back down at the drawing immediately. Their conversations ranged wide during those winter visits. He had grown up in Kentucky. He told her one afternoon while she worked, and he sat with his long legs stretched toward her small stove. Trapping with his father from the age of 8, moving west in the trail of the beaver trade as a young man, following the country higher and higher until he found the San Juans and understood without being able to explain it that this was where he was meant to be. He had been alone on that mountain for 6 years. He said it without self-pity, as a statement of fact, the way you might say that a certain trail ran north. She told him about Missouri, about her mother, who had been the finest herbalist in 3 counties and had treated everyone from the wealthiest families to people who had no money to give but left vegetables from their garden on the doorstep in thanks. About how she had been her mother's student and assistant from childhood, mixing preparations by lamplight, learning the names of plants before she learned her multiplication tables. About how her mother's death had left her not only grieving but purposeless in a way that the West had eventually solved, because the West needed what she knew in a way that Missouri no longer did. She would have liked it here, Eva said once, looking out the frosted window toward the white peaks above the town. "There is more to learn here than anywhere I have ever been." "What do you want to do with it?" Boone asked. "The learning." She thought about it seriously because he asked things seriously, and she found she did not want to give him careless answers. "I want to write it down," she said finally. "A proper guide. Not like the books they print back east that describe plants no one out here has seen. A true guide to what grows in the San Juans, what it does, how to prepare it, what altitude it prefers. Something that would still be useful in 50 years. He was quiet for a moment. "That is worth doing," he said, and the way he said it with that plain, unembellished certainty made it feel more true than if anyone had given her a compliment. By February, she had admitted to herself that she was in love with him. She did this admission with the same methodical honesty she applied to her work, examining the evidence. The way the 3 weeks between his visits stretched differently than any other 3 weeks in her life. The way she noticed new things in the world and thought immediately about telling him. The way his presence in a room settled something in her that she had not realized was unsettled. She admitted it to herself, and then she set it aside, because she did not know what he felt, and she was not a woman who needed to say things aloud that might not be reciprocated. In March, he came down during a hard storm that had most of the town huddled inside, and she met him at her door with the surprise she could not quite hide. "You came down in this," she said, looking past him at the driving snow. "The trail is clear enough if you know where you are going," he said, which she was beginning to understand was his manner of dismissing concerns about his own welfare. He stepped inside and she saw that he was not entirely unaffected by the cold, his color high in his hands, when he removed his gloves, stiff enough that he flexed them a few times to restore the feeling. She took his hands between both of hers without thinking, chafing warmth back into the fingers. She felt him go very still. The storm sound outside filled the small room. "You should be more careful," she said quietly, not looking up. "I know this mountain," he said, his voice lower than usual. "The mountain does not care what you know about it," she said, and she was looking at his hands, at the network of old scars across the knuckles and the thick calluses on his palms, and she was thinking that these hands had built a cabin by themselves and dried medicinal roots with careful attention, and carved small wooden boxes with fitted lids, and she did not want them frostbitten. He turned his hands under hers so that instead of her holding his hands were holding hers. She looked up. He was watching her with something in his amber eyes that was not the measured, careful look he usually gave the world. It was something more direct, something that had run out of patience with being careful. "Eva," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything he had asked but which was, she felt, accurate. He kissed her with the same quality he did everything, fully and without distraction, one large hand coming up to hold her face as if she were something worth being precise about. She kissed him back with something that felt like relief, which was strange, except that it was not, because she had been moving toward this moment through every visit and every conversation and every 3-week stretch of waiting. And the relief was the relief of arriving somewhere you have been traveling toward for a long time. When they separated, both breathing a little unevenly, he kept his hand against her face and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was open in a way his face was not usually open, unguarded, a little uncertain in a way that she found more moving than any confidence would have been. "I am not a man who has much to offer beyond a mountain," he said. "I am a woman who has been looking for a reason to stay on one," she replied. He came down more often after that. Not every 3 weeks, but sometimes every 10 days, sometimes every week when the weather permitted, and the visits were different now. Not less productive, because they were both people of purpose, but warmer in a way that went beyond the stove. He helped her set up a proper drying rack system in the back room, building it to her specifications with wood he brought down from the mountain already cut and shaped. She made him eat properly when he visited because she noticed that he ate the same way he did everything alone, efficiently but without pleasure, and she made food with different intentions. He taught her the mountain in that same winter, in the way he could, through descriptions and the precise sketched maps he drew in her journal. "This trail leads to where the elk winter. This face catches the morning sun earliest and the snow goes first in spring. This drainage is unstable after heavy snow. Do not cross it until June." He gave her the mountain the way another man might give flowers, piece by piece, each piece something useful. She gave him her work. She started explaining not just what she was doing, but why, the logic beneath the practice, the connections between plants that seemed unrelated, the way the same root used in different preparations produced entirely different effects. He listened the way he always listened, with his full weight of attention, and one afternoon he asked a question about the chemical composition of plant compounds that surprised her with its sophistication, and she asked how he knew to ask it. "I found a chemistry primer at the assay office," he said. "Someone left it there last fall. I have been reading it." She stared at him. "You have been reading a chemistry primer." "The trapping is slow in winter," he said simply. She thought she might love him more in that moment than she had ever loved anything in her life. This large, silent, self-sufficient man reading chemistry primers in his mountain cabin in the dark of winter to better understand what she was telling him. She turned back to her work so that he would not see the full extent of what was in her face, and she heard him make the small sound he made when he suspected she was hiding something from him, a low, quietly amused exhalation. Spring came to Creed slowly, the way it always did in the high mountains, grudgingly and with several false starts. A week of warmth followed by a foot of new snow followed by warmth again, the creek running loud with melt, the mud on the main street deep enough to pull boots off. The mining operations resumed their full noise, and the influx of new men arriving for the season brought the usual collection of injuries and illnesses that kept Eva busy from early morning until after dark. Boone came down on a Sunday in early April and found her at her workbench still working at 10 in the morning, looking like she had not slept. She had not slept, as it happened. A cave-in at the Lucky Draw mine the previous evening had sent 4 men to her doorstep, and she had been working on a crush injury that required all of her skill and most of her stores of certain pain preparations. He stood in the doorway looking at her, and without a word he went to her small stove and began making coffee. Then he came to stand behind her at the workbench, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need more plant and leaf," she said without looking up. "I used the last of my dried stock on a wound compress last night. And if you can find fresh willow bark on your way back up, the white willow that grows along the lower creek, that would help with the pain." "I will bring both," he said. Then he put his hands on her shoulders gently with that same quality of precision, as if he were being careful about exactly how much of his strength to apply, and he just held her there for a moment. She closed her eyes and let herself rest into it. "You need to sleep," he said. "I know." "I will watch the door for 2 hours," he said. She would have argued with anyone else. 2 hours, she agreed. She slept for 3. And when she woke, he was sitting on the stool by the door with her journal open on his knee, reading her notes in the careful, deliberate way he read everything, one large finger tracing under lines of text. He had let her sleep the extra hour without concern for their agreement, and she found she was not irritated by this. He brought the plantain and the willow bark 2 days later, along with fresh valerian root he had found in the thaw, and a third plant she had described to him in passing weeks before that he had spent time searching for. "Arnica," she said, looking at the yellow-flowered stems packed carefully in damp moss to keep them fresh. "You said you were almost out. I did not think you were listening when I said that." "I listen to everything you say," he said, with such uncomplicated directness that she had to look away from him again. In May, he took her back up the mountain. The trail was wet with melt, and the air was thick with the smell of warming earth and new growth, and Eva stopped so many times to examine what was emerging from the soil that their progress was extremely slow. Boone never once showed impatience. He waited where she pointed, helped her dig when the root system was deep, held her samples while she recorded notes in her journal, and at one point, when she was so focused on a particularly fine specimen of wild ginger that she walked directly into a tree branch, he caught her by the arm and righted her without comment, then looked at the tree as if it had been discourteous. They reached his cabin in late afternoon. It looked the same as it had the previous autumn, solid and tight against the mountain, the woodpile restocked, the hide rack empty now waiting for the season. He showed her around the back where he had cleared a small patch of ground during the winter, breaking up the rocky soil with evident labor. "I thought you could plant things here," he said, watching her face. "Things that are useful but hard to find. If you tell me what needs what kind of ground, I will prepare it properly." She looked at the small garden plot and then up at him, and something about the gesture, this man who had been preparing space for her on his mountain through the winter, broke something open inside her that she had been keeping carefully closed. "Boone," she said. "I know this is not a proper courtship," he said, meeting her eyes directly, the way he always did, holding nothing back in his gaze. "I know I cannot offer you what a man in town might offer, a proper house, society, the things that women are supposed to want, but I want you here. I have wanted you here since the first morning I made coffee and you were still in that cabin." He paused. "I have not wanted anything with that kind of certainty in a very long time. I wanted to be straight with you about it." She looked at him for a long moment. This vast, careful, precise man with his mountain and his reading and his carved wooden boxes and his small cleared garden plot. "I have been in love with you since February," she said. "When you came down in the storm and told me the trail was clear enough if you know where you are going, as if the blizzard was a minor inconvenience and you simply wanted to see me." Something moved across his face, warm and deep. "I did simply want to see you," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and kissed her in the afternoon light, with the mountains throwing long shadows across the garden plot. And she put her hands on his chest and felt the solid, immovable fact of him, and thought that she had been traveling her entire life toward exactly this place. The summer of 1882 was the most productive and the most joyful of Eva Cooper's life. She divided her time between Creede and the mountain with Boone, spending 3 or 4 days each week in the high country working the garden, gathering specimens across elevations, and recording her findings with a thoroughness that began to look more and more like the book she wanted to write. Boone was her guide through every part of the mountain's geography, taking her to places she would never have found. A high meadow above 12,000 feet, where the growing season was so short that the plants had evolved remarkable adaptive strategies, she documented meticulously. An ancient stand of Engelmann spruce, where a particular moss grew in conditions she had never encountered. A south-facing drainage, where the warmth allowed certain plants to grow fully 2 weeks earlier than anywhere else in the range. He taught her to read the mountain the way he read it, to notice the small signals that preceded weather changes, the way certain birds moved before a storm, the particular color the sky went when the barometric pressure was dropping fast. He taught her which trails were reliable and which were not, where the water sources were, where the footing went treacherous. He gave her the mountain as a living thing to understand rather than a beautiful obstacle to negotiate. She taught him, in return, things he absorbed with that same complete attention. The language of plant communities, why certain plants always grew together, and what that told you about soil and moisture. The history of herbalism, the traditions that ran from ancient Greece through medieval Europe and into the hands of indigenous practitioners across the continent, whose knowledge she had studied and respected, and felt the loss of as it was systematically disregarded by Eastern medicine. He listened to this with a particular focus, because he had spent enough time in wilderness communities to know what the loss of knowledge meant in practical terms. "The Ute people who used to range through here," he said one afternoon, sitting in the meadow above the cabin while she worked through a section of specimens. "They knew this mountain in ways I will never know it." "I know," she said. "The displacement of indigenous peoples from land they understood is a loss for everyone, including people like me who are trying to document what grows here. There are things they knew about these plants that I will never fully recover in a lifetime of study." He was quiet for a moment, looking out across the valley. "I think about that," he said, "more than most men out here seem to." "More than most men out here admit to," she said. He looked at her. "That too," he agreed. They ate together in the evenings, simple meals that Eva made with what they had and what grew around them, and she was surprised by how much she could produce from the mountain itself, wild greens and mushrooms, and the occasional root that was as useful on a dinner plate as in a medicine bundle. After eating, they would sit outside while the light went, watching the valley below where the lights of Creed came on one by one like small, steady stars. And it was in these evening hours that they talked without agenda, about anything and nothing, comfortable in a way that felt earned. He asked her, one late summer evening, if she missed Missouri. She thought about it honestly. "I miss my mother," she said. "Missouri itself, no. There was nothing in Missouri that needed me the way this place does." She looked at him. "And nothing in Missouri that I needed the way I need this." He took her hand. He had not done it dramatically or as a declaration. He simply took her hand and held it, resting on his knee, and they watched the valley lights together. In September, the first snow came early to the high peaks. Eva was in the meadow above the cabin collecting the last of the season's specimens when the sky changed, and the first flakes began to fall, tentative at first, and then with increasing commitment. Boone appeared from the timber edge in minutes, as if he had been monitoring the sky all morning. "We need to get down," he said. "5 more minutes," she said, because she was in the middle of documenting a specimen. "Eva," his voice had the flat, definite quality it got when he was not negotiating. She looked up at the sky. She looked at him. She closed her journal. "All right," she said. They made it to the cabin in the first real push of the storm, and by the time he had the stove roaring and the lamps lit, the world outside was white and nearly invisible. She stood at the window watching it and felt nothing like fear. She felt settled, as if this was precisely where she was supposed to be. "You are smiling," he said from behind her. "I am inside a warm cabin on a mountain in a snowstorm with a man who knows how to keep me safe," she said. "It seems like a reasonable thing to smile about." He came to stand beside her at the window, his arm around her shoulders in that careful, weighted way of his. "You are not afraid of any of this," he said. It was not quite a question. "I was afraid the first time," she said. "When I was lost, I was very afraid." She leaned into him. "I am not afraid anymore." He pressed his lips to her hair, and they stood there watching the snow obliterate the mountain. And Eva thought that this was what safety felt like from the inside. He walked her down to Creed 2 days later when the storm passed, and the new snow settled. The trail deep but manageable in the snowshoes he had fitted to her boots in the spring, moving beside her now rather than in front, because she had learned enough of the mountain's trails by summer's end that the guidance was less tutorial and more companionship. In October, he came down to Creed with more than provisions. He tied his horse at the post in front of her building, a big gray gelding that stood unconcerned in the cold, and came inside. He was clean-shaved, which she had not seen before, and his hair, though still long, was tied back with more care than usual. He was wearing a wool coat she had not seen. He stood in the center of her workroom looking at her with an expression that had more tension in it than she was accustomed to seeing on his face. "Boone," she said carefully. "What is it?" He reached into his coat and produced a ring. It was not a jeweler's ring from a shop. It was a ring he had made himself. She could see that immediately, twisted from silver wire, the kind of silver that came from the mines, worked with real skill into a braid of 3 strands that locked together at the center. "I have been planning this for longer than I will admit to," he said, his voice steady but lower than usual. "And I know I should probably have words prepared. I am not built for prepared words." He met her eyes. "You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life on this earth. You are brave in a way that is not reckless. You are kind in a way that is not soft. You are the only person I have ever met who makes me feel like the world has more in it than I can reach alone." He paused. "I want to marry you. I want you on that mountain as more than a visitor. I want to build this place together, if you will have that." Eva looked at the ring in his large, scarred hand. She looked at his face, open and honest and carrying more vulnerability than she had ever seen him show. "Boone Hayes," she said, her voice steady even though her eyes were not. "I would marry you tomorrow if the preacher were available." His exhale was long and quiet, like a man setting down something heavy. He put the ring on her finger, and it fit as if he had known the size, which he had, because 2 months before he had asked her friend Martha at the dress shop to measure her finger on some fabricated pretext. And Martha had told Eva this the same week, laughing, So Eva had known something was coming, but knowing had not diminished the reality of it at all. They were married the following Saturday by the minister of the small Methodist church at the east end of Creed's Main Street, with Martha and 3 of the minors Eva had treated, and Boone's acquaintance from the general store in attendance. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large. What they wanted was done, and what was done was binding and exactly right. Eva Cooper became Eva Hayes on a Saturday in October 1882 and felt, in every part of herself, that this was the truest and most correct name she had ever carried. They spent the winter divided between the cabin and Creed, setting a rhythm that fit both their natures. Eva kept her apothecary work going in town, because the community needed her and she needed the work, and Boone came down regularly and stayed for days at a time, helping her in ways that were practical and real, hauling supplies, repairing the building's perpetually troublesome door, occasionally, when she needed it, simply being present in the room while she worked late. On the mountain, he maintained the cabin and the traps and began, that first winter together, expanding the cabin with an additional room built against the eastern wall, because the life they were making would eventually need more space than one room could hold. She helped with the building on weekends when she could get up the mountain, not with the heavy work but with the planning, because she had specific ideas about where the light should come through and where she wanted her workbench and what kind of shelf arrangement would suit a drying room, which was the primary use she envisioned for the addition. Boone built it to her specifications without modification, because he had learned over the course of knowing her that her specifications were correct and modification was not improvement. The spring of 1883 brought new challenges and new joys. A bad influenza moved through Creed in March, striking men already weakened by winter's privation, and Eva worked herself to exhaustion managing it with elderberry preparations and steam treatments and the careful use of compounds she had been refining all winter. She saved most of the people who came to her, and the 2 she lost she carried in a quiet part of herself, the way she suspected good healers always carried their losses. Boone, who had come down for provisions and found the situation, stayed for 2 weeks, functioning as her assistant in ways that no one who had not known him would have anticipated. He followed her instructions precisely, prepared and administered treatments with patience, and on the 3rd night when the worst cases were stable and she finally sat down at her workbench and could not move, he picked her up without discussion, carried her the 3 blocks to the rooming house where she still rented a room, and put her to bed with the same unfussy competence with which he did everything. When she emerged from sleep and told him that she was not accustomed to being carried, he said, "I know. You were too tired to object." "I would have objected," she said. "That is why I waited until you could not," he said, and she chose not to pursue it further. By April she was confident that the influenza was past its worst, and she and Boone made the trip up the mountain together in the first real warmth of spring, and the cabin's new room was finished and smelled of fresh pine, and the shelf arrangement was exactly as she had specified, and she stood in the middle of it with the afternoon light coming through the window she had asked for and felt the specific happiness of a space that was genuinely yours. That summer she planted the garden Boone had prepared, expanding on the small cleared plot with beds she designed for specific plants, some for medicinal use, some for culinary, one long bed along the south wall of the cabin specifically for echinacea, which required full sun and good drainage and rewarded care with a root system that could be harvested reliably year after year. Boone built her a cold frame from spare glass and pine board, so she could start seedlings earlier in the short mountain season. He also built, without being asked, a low fence around the garden from the small cedar posts he had cut through the winter, because the deer that wandered through the cabin clearing had discovered the new plantings and found them interesting. Eva worked on her book all through that summer with more focus and more material than she had ever had. The notes she had accumulated over 2 years of mountain work were voluminous, and she began the project of organizing them, writing the descriptions of each plant with the precision she had promised herself, noting altitude range, soil preference, seasonal timing, preparation method, indicated use, and contraindications. Boone read each completed section and gave feedback that was occasionally technical, because he had kept reading through his collection of medical and scientific texts all winter, and occasionally practical, because he knew from experience what conditions people in this country actually faced. "You write about this plant for sleep," he said one evening, reviewing a section on valerian. "But you should say more about the miners. The kind of sleep problems they have are specific. The noise, the irregular hours, the anxiety about cave-ins. Someone reading this will understand the application better if you give them a context." She looked at him across the small table where they both worked in the evenings, him with his trap records and supply accounts, her with her manuscript. "You are going to make this a better book than I intended it to be," she said. He looked up. Something in his amber eyes was comfortable and pleased in a way he did not always show. "That is the idea," he said. In August, Eva told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning in the cabin kitchen, very directly, because she was a direct person, and there was no other way she knew to be. He was at the stove and she was at the table, and she simply said it. He turned around from the stove slowly. He looked at her face for a moment with an expression she had not seen before, something that was layered in a way his usual expressions were not, complex and moving through phases she could track. Surprise, which was brief, followed by something deep and quiet, followed by something that broke through his usual composure entirely. He crossed the kitchen and knelt in front of her chair, which was unusual for a man of his size, and spoke to exactly how seriously he was taking this moment, and he took both her hands in his and looked at her. "Are you all right?" he said first. "I am very well," she said, which was true. "Are you frightened?" She thought about it. "A little," she said. "Not of the baby, of doing it well." "You will do it better than well," he said, with that plain certainty he had applied to her book and her work and everything she had doubted herself about. She put her free hand against his jaw. "We will," she said. He turned his face and pressed his lips to her palm, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through. The autumn of 1883 was spent in preparation and joy, a combination Eva had not expected to find so compatible. She came down from the mountain to Creed earlier than usual, because the baby was due in February, and she wanted the reliability of the town and the doctor, however grudging his collegial manner, available to her. Boone came with her. He did not announce this decision. He simply arrived at the end of October with his horse carrying his winter provisions in the panniers, and a look that said the discussion about this arrangement was already concluded, and he moved into the small house she had rented on Creed's upper street with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to settling the mountain cabin. Within a week he had repaired the back porch, replaced the kitchen stovepipe that had been drafting wrong, and introduced himself to every neighbor on the street with a directness that some found alarming and all found, eventually, respectful. He had never wintered in a town before. Eva watched him navigate it with affectionate attention. He was not a man made for proximity to crowds, and Creed in winter, though quiet compared to summer, was still a town full of people with opinions and noise. He managed it with the patience of a man who had chosen this winter specifically and would manage whatever it required. He also, that winter, proved unexpectedly useful to the community in ways that went beyond his wife's medical practice. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was brutal, one of the coldest in local memory, and the infrastructure of a boom town built in haste showed its weakness in cold weather. Boone spent half his time that winter helping neighbors whose pipes froze, whose roofs collapsed under snow weight, whose horses needed shelter that did not exist. He did not charge. He did not announce what he was doing. He simply saw what needed doing and did it, the way he had always operated, on the principle that capability creates obligation. The community, which had regarded Eva's mountain man husband with a certain wariness, began to regard him differently. The mining supervisor whose roof he helped shore up in January became a warm acquaintance. The family on the lower street whose pipes he thawed in February left venison stew on their doorstep for a week. Eva watched this with pride and love in equal measure, and she said to him one evening, "You are becoming a town person." He gave her the look. "I am becoming a person who is in a town for a reason," he corrected. "The reason is leaving in spring." "The reason is staying as long as the reason needs to stay," she said. He looked at her rounded middle. "Fair," he said quietly. Their son was born on a Tuesday in February 1884, just as the sun was coming up and laying its light across the frosted window of the bedroom where Eva had labored through the night with the doctor and the midwife and Boone, who had been asked to wait outside and had spent the night in the hallway moving, based on the sounds the midwife reported later, approximately the same number of miles as a man walking a full day's trail. He came in when they called him, filling the doorway in a way that the space was clearly not designed for, and the midwife placed the baby in his arms, and he held the child with a carefulness that was almost painful to watch. The massive hands that split firewood and handled steel traps reduced to the most precise and tender instruments, cradling this small new person with total attention. He looked at Eva, who was exhausted and luminous, and watching his face. "He looks like the mountain," Boone said, which made no literal sense and perfect emotional sense. "He does," she agreed. They named him Callum James Hayes. Callum for no one in particular because it sounded solid and uncompromising. James for Eva's father, who had been a good man. Callum was, from his first weeks, exactly what you would expect from the union of these two people: opinionated, curious, and deeply uninterested in sleeping at conventional hours. Eva managed the feeding and the early care with the same systematic competence she brought to her apothecary work, and Boone managed everything else with a devotion that she felt physically watching. He walked the baby at 3 in the morning when the crying would not stop, pacing the small house with that long, patient stride, large hand spread across the infant's back with the same careful precision. He changed his sleep without complaint to suit the baby's demands. He took the boy outside at first opportunity, the moment the late March weather permitted, and she watched from the window while he showed his son the sky with the gravity of a man introducing someone to the most important place they would ever know. They went back up the mountain in May, all 3 of them, and Eva watched Boone carry the baby in a carrier he had made himself through the winter from soft tanned leather, strapped to his chest, the infant alert and wide-eyed at the new world coming past on both sides of the trail. Callum's first experience of the mountain was strapped to his father's chest, level with the man's heartbeat, watching the spruce and the sky. Eva thought there were worse ways to enter a life. The mountain garden was a success by its second full season. The echinacea was establishing beautifully, the valerian had naturalized in the drainage below the south wall, and a stand of arnica she had transplanted from higher elevation had taken to the prepared bed with enthusiasm. She worked the garden in the mornings while Callum slept in his carrier hanging from the rafter hook Boone had installed for exactly this purpose, and wrote in the afternoons, and the book was coming into its final shape now, organized and detailed and honest in the way she had always intended. Boone read the completed manuscript over 2 weeks of evenings. He made very few suggestions, but the ones he made were precise and always correct. When he finished the last page, he set it down on the table and looked at her. "This is the best thing I have ever read," he said. She laughed. "You have read a chemistry primer and a medical botany text and 2 books whose spines you have rubbed off." "And some Emerson," he said. And this is the best." She held his gaze. "I dedicated it to you," she said. He looked at the manuscript. He had not read the dedication page because she had always kept it face down when he was reading. He turned it over now and read it, and she watched him read it, watched his face do the thing it did when something reached him and he had no defense prepared for it. The dedication read, "For Boone Hayes, who found me lost on a mountain and has guided me through every season since. The mountain is his. The knowledge is mine. The life is ours." He looked at her across the table for a long moment. "Eva," he said, in the voice he used when words were insufficient, but he was going to try anyway. "I know," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and pulled her up and held her with his arms around her entirely. His face bent to her hair, and she pressed her palms flat against his back and felt the reality of him, the solid, enduring weight of him, and she thought that she would write 1,000 books and every one of them would be dedicated to this. The years that followed were built from seasons, each one distinct and good. In the autumn of 1885, Eva shipped her completed manuscript to a publisher in Denver who had been mentioned to her by a land surveyor passing through Creed, who had heard from someone else that this particular house was interested in practical Western subjects. She sent it with a letter explaining its purpose and scope, and heard nothing for 3 months, which she accepted without excessive anxiety, because anxiety was not useful and the work was done and good regardless of what the publisher decided. The letter that came in January said yes. Boone read the letter twice, which was unusual because he read things once as a general rule. Then he set it on the table very carefully, as if it were fragile, and looked at her. "They are publishing it," she said, because she had already read it twice herself. "I know what it says," he replied. His voice was low and warm, and she could hear everything in it, all the pride he had no complicated way to express, the straightforward love of a man who did not embellish but felt enormously. "Half of it is your observations," she said. "Your maps, your altitude notes, your trail knowledge." "None of it is my words," he said. "It is your words, that is what it is." The book was published in the spring of 1886 under the title, "A Practical Guide to the Medicinal Plants of Colorado's San Juan Mountains," by Eva Hayes, and it was received with genuine appreciation by the medical and botanical communities that encountered it, as well as by the practical communities of mining towns and frontier settlements who found in it exactly what she had promised, a guide that was genuinely useful for the life people were actually living. A copy came to the Creed apothecary in a packet of 6, and Eva put one on the shelf with the price marked, and the others in a box under the counter to give to the women she had trained, the 2 who had become genuinely skilled and were now operating their own small practice in the valley below. She sent one to the assay office in memory of the chemistry primer Boone had borrowed, and she kept one for herself and one for the cabin, which Boone shelved with the Emerson and the remaining readable volumes on the shelf above the workbench, placed it there with a care and precision that told her everything. Life on the mountain deepened in its rhythms. Callum grew into a solemn, observant child who was most happy outdoors, which surprised no one who knew his parents. By the time he was 3, he could identify a dozen plants by sight, not because Eva had formally taught him, but because she talked about what she was doing as she worked, and he listened the way children listen when they are paying actual attention. Boone taught him to track before he was 4, taking him on slow circuits of the cabin clearing and pointing out the signs left by animals in the passage through: deer prints in the mud of the spring runoff, the scratch marks of a bear against a spruce trunk, the disturbed duff of a coyote's excavation. Callum absorbed all of it with the same contained seriousness his father brought to teaching. In the summer of 1887, Eva told Boone about the second baby over breakfast, the same direct way as the first. He was better prepared this time for the information, though no less moved by it. He looked up from his coffee with the slow amber gaze and said, "Is it spring again? What does that mean?" "Last time you told me in summer," he said. "I was calculating." She laughed out loud, which woke Callum in the next room, and Boone was smiling, the full open smile that she was still, after 5 years, somewhat undone by, and that morning was one of those mornings she filed in her most permanent memory. Their daughter arrived in February 1888, a hard birth that lasted longer than Callum's and required more of Eva and more of the doctor, and required Boone to stand in the hallway for 6 hours instead of 3. When they called him in, he moved with less control than he had with the first child, his composure somewhat eroded by the night, and he held the girl in his arms and looked at Eva with something that was beyond expression, some combination of relief and gratitude and love that his face simply could not entirely contain. "She looks like you," he said, which Eva was not sure was accurate, the baby being new enough that she looked primarily like herself, but she accepted it. They named her Ruth for Eva's mother, whose middle name it had been. Ruth Hayes came into the world in February with dark hair, and from the first week, a voice that made her opinion about various matters extremely clear. She was nothing like the contained, observant Callum, or at least she was observant in her own way, observant and vocal, and utterly certain that her needs were the most important item on any agenda. Boone, to Eva's perpetual delight, was entirely managed by this infant daughter. He, who was unmanaged by weather and terrain, and the full force of mountain winters, was completely reorganized by a 7-pound girl who communicated primarily through volume. He held her at every opportunity. He sang to her, which Eva had not known he could do, low and off-key and earnest, old Kentucky songs that came out of him in the dark of the night when the baby would not settle. Eva lay in bed listening to his deep voice moving through those old songs and felt the specific happiness of hearing a private person be fully private, no audience intended. By spring, both children were on the mountain with them, and the cabin, with its addition and its garden and its 10 years of careful habitation, had become fully what a home is supposed to be, a place that shows the evidence of lives well lived inside it. Eva's drying herbs hung from the kitchen rafters. Boone's tools occupied the workbench with the same systematic order. Callum's hand-drawn maps of the trails around the cabin were pinned to the wall beside his father's. Ruth's carved wooden horse, made for her by Boone from white pine, sat on the shelf beside the Emerson and the Hayes medicinal guide. One evening in the summer of 1888, Eva and Boone sat outside the cabin in the last light, the way they had sat on their first summer evenings, watching the lights of Creed come on in the valley below. Callum was inside reading by lamplight, and Ruth was asleep in the addition's smaller room, the one that had become the children's room in the reorganization of the previous winter. 10 years ago I was lost on this mountain, Eva said, not to begin a conversation but because she was thinking it aloud. 6 years ago, Boone said. It was 1882, she said. I found you in autumn of 1882, and it is now summer 1888. That is 6 years. She paused. It feels like 10. Is that good or bad? He was watching her with the amber gaze, the evening light making him look exactly as he had that first afternoon when she had come around the shoulder of the mountain and found him splitting wood. It is extraordinary, she said. More has happened in 6 years than in the previous 24 combined. He reached over and took her hand, the same simple gesture, no announcement. It is going to keep happening, he said. I know, she said. That is what I like about it. They were quiet for a while. The lights of Creed came on one by one in the valley. I want to expand the garden, Eva said. I know, I already planned the clearing for the north bed. I will start cutting it before the snow. I have not told you about the north bed yet. You said in March that the primary limitation on the Arnica expansion was space, he said, and that the only suitable aspect was north of the cedar fence. I have been planning it since March. She looked at him. He was entirely serious. He had been planning the garden expansion she had not yet formally requested since March because he had been listening in March, the way he listened to everything. Boone Hayes, she said. Eva Hayes, he replied. I love you a very great deal, she said. He squeezed her hand once, firm and certain. I know, he said. The same applies. It was not poetry, it was not flowery. It was Boone Hayes speaking the plain truth in the plainest terms available to him, which was, she had long understood, the most intimate thing he knew how to do. He did not ornament things. He said what was true, and what was true was enough and more than enough. The years moved through their seasons, each one building on the last. Eva's book was adopted by 2 medical schools in the East as supplementary reading for students heading west, and she was contacted by a professor at the Colorado School of Mines who asked if she would be willing to contribute to a survey of the state's natural plant resources being compiled for the new state government. She wrote her section at the cabin workbench over 2 winters, Boone reading drafts and occasionally coming in from outside, with a specimen she had referenced that he had just found on the slope above, as if the mountain itself were cooperating. Callum, at 7 and 8 and 9, was increasingly his father's companion on the mountain's trails, learning the trapping trade with a seriousness that Boone met with patience and care. But he also, to Eva's quiet joy, showed an interest in her work, sitting beside her at the workbench in the evenings and asking questions about the plants she was processing with a focus that was unmistakably his father's. She gave him his own journal, a small leather-bound book she bought in Creed, and he began filling it with his own observations, careful child's drawings of plants and tracks and weather patterns, a record of his world in the specific detail that was his inheritance from both his parents. Ruth, at 3 and 4, was a different proposition entirely. She was interested in everything and afraid of nothing, and had an opinion about the appropriate management of every situation she encountered. She informed Boone that his method of stacking firewood was inefficient, which made him stop and genuinely consider whether she was right, and she told Eva that the color sequence of the drying herbs on the kitchen rafter should be reorganized by species rather than harvest date, which was also not entirely wrong. She was 4 years old. Eva looked at her sometimes with the affectionate terror of a person who recognizes themselves in a face that is entirely its own. In the spring of 1891, when Callum was 7 and Ruth was 3, Eva received a letter from a woman in Telluride, 2 mountain ranges west, who had read the book and was attempting to practice herbalism in a mining community with no medical support and limited resources, and who had specific questions about altitude-adjusted preparation methods. Eva wrote back a letter that turned into 3 pages. Then another letter came, and another, and within a year she had a correspondence with 6 women across the San Juan region who were using her book as a foundational text and needed ongoing support. She mentioned to Boone that she was thinking about something in the provisional way she floated ideas she had not fully committed to. "Tell me," he said. "I want to hold a gathering," she said, "here in Creed or near it. Bring the women who are doing this work together for a week, share techniques and specimens, work on the problems they are facing." He was quiet for a moment. "How many women? Perhaps 8 or 10 if all those writing to me could make the journey. You would need space in town." "I was thinking the church hall, if Reverend Mathers would allow it, and perhaps some of them could stay with families who have room. How much would it cost to run?" She had not finished the accounting. She said so. "Do the accounting," he said. "I have some winter fur money I have not allocated, and you could charge a small fee for the week for materials." She looked at him. "You would fund this." "We would fund this," he corrected, which was such a small word change and such a large one. The gathering happened in June 1891. 10 women from 5 different settlements across the San Juan Range, bringing their specimens and their questions and their hard-won experience to a week of shared work in the Creed Church Hall that Eva organized with the same thoroughness she applied to her manuscript. Boone transported supplies up from the general store, built a temporary drying rack system in the hall's back room, and largely made himself scarce, except at the end of each day when he appeared to help with cleanup and carry things that needed carrying. And the women who had not met him before looked at this enormous careful man who materialized at the end of the day to assist his wife's work, and regarded him with expressions that Eva had seen on many women's faces over the years. Pure, uncomplicated appreciation for the specificity of what she had found. The gathering was the first of what became an annual event. Eva ran it for 7 consecutive years, the collection of women growing each year, the scope of the work expanding, the network of herbalist practitioners across Colorado becoming something real and functional rather than isolated individuals working in separate valleys. She wrote about it in the letters she sent east, and eventually the correspondence led to recognition that she had not sought but accepted with the practical attitude she brought to everything. If recognition led to resources that supported the work, then recognition was useful. Boone watched her build this with the same attention he had given everything about her from the beginning, and there was in his watching a quality of pride so consistent it had become simply the backdrop of his regard for her, the warm constant beneath everything else. When Callum was 12 and Ruth was 8, they had what Eva described in her journal as a full house winter. That was the winter when a family of 6 who had been traveling through Creed got stranded by an early blizzard, their wagon disabled and their provisions low, and Boone, who had come to town for supplies when the storm hit, installed them in the spare bedroom of the Creed house and half the downstairs without discussion. Eva came home from the apothecary to find a family she had never met being served dinner at her kitchen table by her husband with total equanimity. She looked at the scene. She looked at Boone. He raised an eyebrow that said, "You would have done the same thing. She would have done the same thing." She went and introduced herself to the family and helped serve dinner, and they stayed for 3 weeks while the wagon was repaired and the pass cleared. And in those 3 weeks, Callum taught their eldest son the mountain trail system from memory, using the maps he had drawn, and Ruth adopted their youngest daughter as a temporary sister with the full force of her personality. And the family left with preserved food from Eva's stores and Boone's careful directions through the pass, and a letter of introduction to the general store in Montrose that might help them find work. The father of the family, a quiet man named Del Haverstock who had not said much in 3 weeks but had worked steadily alongside Boone in silent, competent partnership, shook Boone's hand at the wagon before leaving. He held it for a moment. "I do not know how to thank you properly," he said. "You helped me stack that wood," Boone said, which was his complete accounting of what had passed between them. Del looked at him for a moment, and then he nodded once, the way men nod when something is understood that does not require further words, and they drove away through the cleared pass in their repaired wagon with their 6 children and their winter's worth of provisions. Eva stood beside Boone watching the wagon go and put her arm around his waist. He put his arm around her shoulders. "You have a soft heart," she said. "I have a practical understanding of what people need when they are stuck," he said. "You are splitting a very thin hair," she said. He looked down at her. The amber eyes were warm and amused and entirely undefended. "Maybe," he said. By 1895, Callum was 11 and growing into a young man who was, at various moments, recognizably both of his parents and entirely himself. He had Boone's physical build emerging, the wide shoulders and long arms that promised his father's stature, and Eva's habit of stopping mid-task to write something down, and his own particular quality that was neither of them, a kind of dry and gentle humor that revealed itself in small moments, and was, Eva thought, perhaps the best thing about him. He was serious about the mountain in a way that was professional even at 11, treating the knowledge Boone had given him as a responsibility rather than entertainment. He had begun his own small trap line, run with his father's supervision, and was keeping accounts of his results in the journal Eva had given him years before, which was now full, and had been replaced by a second and was approaching a third. Ruth at 7 was in school in Creed and was apparently an educational force that her teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Aldridge, described as stimulating. Ruth had corrected Mrs. Aldridge on a point of natural history in September, graciously but thoroughly, using citations from her mother's book, and Mrs. Aldridge, to her credit, had acknowledged the correction and asked Ruth to share what she knew about the subject with the class. This had gone extremely well. Eva told Boone this story at dinner, and he listened with his expression entirely controlled and then said, "She comes by it honestly, and looked at Eva with the specific look he reserved for when he felt something amusing that he was not going to say aloud. "She got it from you," Eva said. "You are the one who told the assay office manager last winter that his lead sample test was incorrect and proceeded to explain why." "I had read the procedure," Boone said. "You had read the procedure," Eva agreed. Ruth, overhearing this exchange from the other room, appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, "What did I get from who?" And both her parents looked at her with the coordinated, helpless affection of people who have long since lost the ability to resist this particular small person. The years that followed were years of deep-rooted happiness, the kind that does not announce itself but accumulates. The garden on the mountain grew and diversified. Eva's correspondence expanded to include exchanges with botanists in Europe who had encountered her book through professional networks, and she received letters in 3 languages, which she answered in English with careful and detailed responses. Boone expanded the cabin once more in 1897, adding a sleeping loft above the main room that became Callum's, freeing the small addition room for Ruth, who had declared her need for a proper room of her own, with the conviction of someone who had been thinking about it for some time. Eva watched her family build their shape against the mountain across all those seasons, and felt the deep satisfaction of a person who has found the thing they were meant to do with their life, and is doing it. Her practice in Creed was well established and respected. Her book was in its 3rd printing. Her annual gathering of mountain herbalists had grown to 20 women, and had been written about in a Denver newspaper that somehow led to a letter from the University of Colorado expressing interest in her expertise on the plant resources of the high San Juans. She and Boone talked about that letter at length, lying in the dark of the mountain cabin one night in the autumn of 1898, the wind outside doing what the autumn wind did in the San Juans, which was remind you comprehensively that winter was not a concept but a condition. "You should meet with them," he said. "It would mean going to Boulder," she said. "I have been to Boulder," he said. She looked at him in the dark. "You have never mentioned going to Boulder." "It was a long time ago, before the mountain." He was quiet for a moment. "It is a manageable trip. We could take Ruth. Callum can manage the cabin and the lower traps for a week." "You would come," she said. "Where you go, I go," he said. It was simple, uncomplicated fact. The same quality as everything he said about things that mattered. "Where you go, I go." Not a romantic declaration, though it was that, but a statement of logistics and intention together. The way Boone Hayes operated, function and devotion indistinguishable. She moved closer to him in the dark, fitting herself against his warmth. He settled his arm around her with the familiar weight of it, and the wind moved outside the cabin walls, and she thought that she had been carried through 16 years of seasons by this man's certainty, and there was not a single one she would have traded. They went to Boulder in the spring of 1899. Boone wore the wool suit he had ordered from the tailor in Creed, which fitted his large frame imperfectly but with dignity, and he navigated the university grounds with his mountain man's unconcerned competence, as if he walked among academic buildings regularly, and found them not particularly more complex than high-country terrain. Ruth, who was 15 and had developed her mother's hair and her father's self-possession and her own formidable intellect, attended the meeting at the university with them, and asked 2 questions that impressed the professor conducting it into a brief, visible silence. Eva negotiated a consulting arrangement that would allow her to contribute to the university's Colorado Flora Survey without relocating, which was the only arrangement she would consider, and the university, having spent 2 hours in her company and 1 hour in the company of her husband and daughter, agreed readily. Callum, who had managed the cabin and traps alone for the week of their absence, and delivered an accurate accounting of everything that had occurred in their absence upon their return, was 17 by then, and had the look of his father at 25, broad and steady and clear-eyed, with a patience about him that was all Boone, but a precision of speech that was all Eva. He was going to be a remarkable man. Eva knew it with the certainty of someone who has been watching a person grow for 17 years. In the summer of 1900, Eva and Boone Hayes sat on the step of their mountain cabin in the evening light, the same step they had sat on every summer evening for 17 years. The garden was full and rich, the echinacea in full flower, the valerian releasing its particular heavy scent on the warm air, the arnica along the fence lined gold against the green. The woodpile was already tall for winter. The hides on the rack spoke of a productive season. The cabin behind them was full of the evidence of their lives, the books and the tools and the children's journals, the stacked provisions and the dried herbs and the carved wooden boxes on the shelf. Callum was down in Creed, working a partnership with a freighting operation that was taking his mountain knowledge into practical commerce. He had a girl in town, a steady-natured young woman named Elise whose father ran the lumber yard, and Eva thought they would probably announce something before another year was out. Ruth was in the addition room, reading with the lamp on, visible through the window as a silhouette bent over pages, which was the image of her mother so exact it sometimes stopped Eva in place. The valley below was lit with Creed's lights, more of them now than in 1882 when two people had first watched them come on together. "We have had a good life," Eva said. Boone looked at her. The amber eyes were the same. The years had put lines around them, and his dark hair was threaded with gray, and the beard he still trimmed but had never tamed was more silver than black now. He was still enormous and still capable, and still moved through the mountains terrain with the same unconcerned authority. He looked at his wife, who was 42 years old and wore her knowledge and her years as comfortably as she wore her coat, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with his full weight of attention and nothing kept back. "We have had the best life," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder as she had leaned it 1,000 evenings before. His arm came around her as it always did. The wind moved through the spruce above the cabin, and the lights of Creed held steady in the valley, and the mountain held them both up, the way it had held them from the beginning. Somewhere below, their son was making his future, and in the window their daughter read by lamplight, and the garden full of useful growing things breathed out into the summer dark. The book Eva had written sat on the shelf inside beside the Emerson and the chemistry primer, and the medical botany text with the inaccurate Eastern descriptions, all of them worn now with use and years. "I was thinking," Eva said quietly, "that I might begin another book." She felt his breath shift slightly the way it did when he was trying not to show that something pleased him. "What about," he said, "the people," she said, "not the plants, the women who have done this work across the region, their stories, their methods, what they have built." She paused. "It should be recorded, it should exist in a way that lasts." He was quiet for a moment, the good quiet, the thinking quiet. "You would need to travel to gather it," he said, "to the other settlements." "Yes." "I will take you," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him. "Where you go," he said simply, "I go." She put her hand against his jaw, as she had done in a Creed kitchen in a March blizzard in 1883, the motion so familiar now it felt like breathing. He turned his face and pressed his lips to her palm, as he had done then, as he had done 100 times, every time the same and every time new. The mountain rose above them in the dark, patient and enormous and permanent. The garden grew. The lights held in the valley. And the life they had made from a lost woman on a ledge and a mountain man with an axe continued its good work, season after season after season, exactly as it was always going to. Ruth appeared in the cabin doorway behind them, lamp in hand, her face the face of her mother's youth with her father's steady gaze. "Are you going to sit out here all night?" she said, with the particular tone of a young woman who finds her parents' sentiment both embarrassing and beloved. "Yes," said Boone. "Probably," said Eva. Ruth made a sound that was equal parts exasperation and affection and went back inside, and they heard her settle into her chair, and the lamp light steadied in the window, and Eva and Boone Hayes sat together on the step of their mountain home in the last of the summer dark, holding everything they had built between them, which was more than enough, and would last longer than either of them could see.